Welcome back to the deep dive. We take complex sources, unpack them, and pull out the facts you really need.
And today, we're tackling something quite heavy.
Yeah, we are. It's a deep dive into a paper by scientific analyst Justin Lake. It's called The Criminalization of Error When Tragedy Becomes Punishment.
And it's a challenging read, honestly. It really makes you question how our legal system deals with, well, basic human imperfection.
Right. Lake's core claim is pretty provocative. He says the line between a tragedy, just a terrible accident, and an actual crime has basically dissolved.
Vanished, yeah. He goes so far as to say that justice in these cases has become indistinguishable from retribution. That's a strong statement.
It really is. It flips the script, doesn't it? He's saying society, or maybe the legal system representing it, can't really process the idea of a pure accident anymore.
That idea of an unfortunate convergence of human imperfection and circumstance, as he puts it, seems like that category is just gone.
Instead, the impulse is always to find someone to blame. A villain.
Exactly. Lake kicks off by arguing that today there's this demand for punishment for almost any mistake that leads to a bad outcome. Someone has to be the culprit for every loss.
So if something awful happens,
The system seems geared to punish, almost automatically. Whether there was actual criminal intent in the traditional sense becomes, well, secondary.
the outcome itself drives the train.
Pretty much. The focus shifts massively onto the result, not necessarily the mental state or the split-second lapse that caused it.
Okay, so our mission today is clear. We need to unpack Lake's analysis. How are these, normal human limits a slow reaction, a moment of distraction? How are they being legally twisted?
Yeah, how are they reframed? Not as just, being human, but as actual criminal intent.
We need to get into the mechanics of how Lake says tragedy gets turned into retribution. All right, let's start with that foundation. The line blurring between accident and crime. Lake says an accident, once seen as that unfortunate convergence, is now almost always pursued as a punishable failure. Why? What's behind this? He says the law has little patience for fallibility.
Well, he's really pointing to the fading importance of mens rea, the guilty mind. Historically, you needed the wrongful act, sure, the actus reus, but you also needed a specific mental state.
Intent, knowledge, maybe extreme recklessness.
Right, and simple fallibility, just messing up because you're human, that was often the built-in defense. If something tragic happened because someone's brain lagged for a second or their judgment slipped under pressure,
Criminal charges usually wouldn't stick.
generally, no. But Lake argues that's changed. That tolerance is gone, replaced by this absolute demand for a response. And the response has to be punishment.
So if a mistake causes terrible harm,
Lake says the mistake itself gets reinterpreted instantly. It's not seen as just a random error anymore. It's retroactively framed as, deep indifference or conscious negligence.
the space for a pure accident just shrinks away.
To almost nothing, in his view. The legal analysis seems to start with the awful outcome, not the action itself.
And he's very clear about where this plays out, the courtroom. He calls it a theater of emotion, not a place for reasoned judgment.
Yeah, that theater metaphor is key. It's about performance, about satisfying an emotional need, rather than a cool-headed search for objective truth.
The traditional idea of the courtroom detached, focused on evidence, applying statutes.
Lake argues that's been pushed aside by this overwhelming emotional drive, often fueled by public grief, maybe media attention too.
Which changes the goalposts. Lake says juries are after closure instead of truth. How does that work? How does the courtroom become this stage?
Well, think about how trials are framed. Victim impact statements, for instance. They're incredibly important for families, obviously, but Lake suggests they shift the trial's focus
Away from the defendant's state of mind at the time.
is squarely onto the immense suffering caused with the event. By focusing so intensely on the pain, which is understandable, it's needed for catharsis. The legal process kind of pushes the tricky question of intent into the background.
The sheer weight of the loss drives the verdict.
That seems to be his argument. And if juries want closure,
Lake says prosecutors chase catharsis instead of justice. So the whole process is geared towards ending the story, right? Giving society that feeling of balance restored through punishment.
even if the facts point to just an unavoidable human error.
Exactly.
And when that narrative becomes more important than the evidence, that's what Lake calls moral revisionism.
Okay, explain that. Moral revisionism.
It's this process, he says, where after something terrible happens, the system rebuilds the story. It takes an accidental event and crafts it into this narrative of of terrible recklessness or callous indifference.
This is the rewriting he talks about. And he insists it happens not because the evidence really shows criminal intent.
But because, as he puts it, the emotional logic of punishment demands it. The outcome is so bad, the thinking goes, someone must have been criminally negligent. So the system works backwards to confirm that.
It's like the tragedy creates this emotional debt.
Yeah, a debt that has to be paid.
Right.
And since you can't change the outcome, you adjust the interpretation of the person's mindset to fit.
So, like, simple negligence. A mistake anyone could make.
Gets potentially elevated to gross negligence, carrying much heavier penalties purely because the consequence was devastating. The legal framework gets sort of reverse engineered from the outcome.
That makes the whole system feel like a societal pressure valve.
Mm,
If something awful happens, like a child dying from a momentary lapse, it's too hard for society to accept that it might just be random, cruel chance.
right. We need a reason. We need someone to blame to make sense of the unbearable.
And Lake says the justice system now provides that person. It offers up a neat narrative, bad actor, reckless choice to replace the messy, unsatisfying reality of human limits.
It becomes this powerful, if maybe cynical way to manage collective grief and anger. Here's a defendant. Focus your fury here.
Okay, let's move into section 2. Lake really anchors his argument here in, well, science, the hard facts in biology and cognition.
Yes, this is where his background as a scientific analyst really comes through. He states flatly that humans are, by design, fallible.
Taking error out of the moral playground and putting it in the lab almost.
Exactly. He spends time detailing these inherent limits. We aren't perfect processors, even though we sometimes think we are. Scientifically, it's just not the case.
So what specific limits does he highlight? These aren't moral flaws, he's saying. They're just part of the package of being human.
He lists a few key ones. First, reaction times falter. Simple physics and biology, it takes time for our nerves and brain to perceive, process, and act. There's always a lag.
Unavoidable.
Unavoidable. Second, judgment lapses. Especially when we're tired, stressed, dealing with poor visibility or confusing information. Our brains use shortcuts, heuristics, which are usually great, but can fail badly in high-stakes moments.
And third,
Reflexes betray us. We might freeze, overcorrect, flinch, do the wrong thing automatically and panic. These are reflexes, not conscious choices.
and he stresses these are ordinary limits of the body and mind. This really shifts the conversation. That driver who hesitates for half a second too long, one of his examples,
Yeah.
he's saying that half second isn't a character flaw. It's literally the time it takes for signals to cross synapses under pressure.
Absolutely. Think about reaction time studies. Best case, simple reaction is around 200 milliseconds. Making a complex choice adds way more time. So if a tragedy turns on 500 milliseconds, half a second, Lake argues the law is treating that biological fact, that lag, as if it were a conscious choice to be unsafe.
The law demands a reaction speed that might be physically impossible for that person in that moment.
That's the implication. There's this huge gap between the reality how humans operate under stress and how the law interprets their actions after the fact.
Okay, so let's look at his examples. The driver hesitating half a second too long.
It's a powerful one because it's relatable. If an accident happens and braking half a second earlier might have prevented it, it's easy for a prosecution to frame that hesitation as gross negligence.
Failure to pay attention, reckless disregard.
Right. That tiny inherent delay gets reconstructed as this period of deliberate indifference. And suddenly, the driver's a criminal, punished for having a normal human nervous system.
Then there's the worker who misjudges a machine's timing.
Yeah, in an industrial setting. These errors can often stem from fatigue, repetitive strain, pressure to work faster, systemic issues.
But the focus stays on the individual's misjudgment.
Often, yes. That cognitive slip, maybe caused by exhaustion, not malice, gets reframed as a willful violation of safety rules. Lake points out it's often easier to prosecute the worker than to look at the corporate environment, the long hours, the pressure that made the error more likely.
And the third one, the parent who glances away, that hits hard.
It's maybe the most terrifying example because it's so universal. Every single person who has cared for a child knows that split-second of distraction is possible. It's just human attention flickers.
But if tragedy results?
Lake argues the resulting criminal charges, often neglect or even manslaughter, hinge entirely on the outcome. They retroactively paint that fleeting lapse of attention as some kind of sustained intentional indifference. The trauma of the result is used to basically invent an evil intent that wasn't there.
So the core point is this systemic reconstruction. The system refuses to accept the instantaneous, unavoidable limit.
Right. It takes that half-second delay, that momentary glance, and blows it up into a conscious criminal act, malice or sustained indifference.
The law basically forces the definition of intent onto an action that was fundamentally reflexive or just, a glitch in the system.
And that's why Lake called these unavoidable facts. You can't argue with the biology. But the legal system, he says, driven by this emotional need for someone to be accountable, kind of sidesteps the biology.
And focuses only on the moral story demanded by the terrible outcome.
And this didn't just happen overnight, right? Lake is clear about that.
No, he traces a gradual shift. He says it's taking place over the last several decades.
Which lines up historically with things like the tough-on-crime era, mandatory minimums, a move away from thinking about rehabilitation.
Exactly. He defines the shift clearly, away from rehabilitation towards vengeance. What did rehabilitation even look like in this context, and how did vengeance take over?
Well, rehabilitation was more forward-looking, preventing future harm, understanding why the error or crime happened, helping the person reintegrate. Even for accidental harm, maybe the focus was education or changing regulations.
Okay.
But the vengeful path, Lake says, is all about the past. It's about ensuring the pain caused is balanced by pain inflicted. The purpose of punishment changes from fixing something to just inflicting suffering.
He also says it moved from proportional response towards symbolic demonstration. That sounds subtle. What's the difference?
Proportional response tries to match the punishment fairly to the proven crime, considering intent and culpability. Symbolic demonstration is more about the audience.
Punishment as theater again?
Kind of. It's designed to satisfy public anger, send a message of zero tolerance. Lake suggests that in these cases, especially where the root cause was accidental, the sentence often ends up being way harsher than the actual culpability warrants.
So the harsh sentence isn't really about the defendant's specific failure.
It becomes a symbol. It shows the state is angry too, it's taking decisive action, even if that action is disproportionate to the mistake itself.
Which connects back to what he calls this societal hunger for accountability. He says it's become so absolute we can no longer tolerate the randomness of suffering. Why is randomness so hard to accept now?
Well, randomness is unsettling, isn't it? We live in this technologically advanced world. We plan everything. We have safety nets. We like to think we're in control.
And a random devastating accident shatters that illusion.
Completely. Lake suggests we're so invested in control and predictability that when awful things happen just by chance, we can't accept it. We need to find a lever, someone to hold responsible. And the legal system offers that lever.
By providing someone to punish.
Right. Control regained, in a sense.
He notes that when tragedy hits, the question immediately changes. It's not what happened anymore.
Which is a complex question, right? It involves systems, circumstances, maybe technical details.
Instead, we instantly ask, who failed?
And that shift is everything. What happened allows for complexity, for systemic failure, for sheer bad luck. Who failed demands an individual, a moral failing.
And that demand becomes non-negotiable.
Yes. And Lake says the law then obliges, offering up a defendant to absorb the grief and fury that reality itself refuses to answer.
So the law ends up performing this public therapy role, far removed from objective justice.
The defendant, whose error might have been utterly human and momentary, becomes this necessary sacrifice to balance the emotional books for society.
It channels all that unmanageable grief and anger away from, say, questioning systems or accepting randomness.
And focuses it safely onto one person. It's an effective way to maintain social calm, Blake suggests, but potentially profoundly unjust to the individual caught in the crosshairs.
Looking at the consequences of all this, how the law operates now, Lake calls it a quiet cruelty disguised as justice. Why quiet?
Because it's not necessarily about overt brutality. The cruelty lies in that subtle, legalistic recasting of reflexive error.
Taking the split-second decision, the hesitation, the panic,
and treating it legally as if it were a drawn-out, conscious act of disregard or malice. The cruelty is punishing someone for a biological or cognitive limit they couldn't control in that moment.
To treat freezing and panic as equivalent to plotting harm, that does sound cruel. The person knows it was a reflex, but the system insists they were reckless, even wicked.
Lake emphasizes the psychological damage this does. You're forced to accept a narrative about yourself that you were criminally reckless when, deep down it was just a physical or mental glitch, a moment of being fallibly human.
And the legal tool for this. He points to the expansion of felony statutes. They used to be for willful violence, clear intent.
Right. And he argues these serious charges, with serious time, have been stretched. They now cover actions born of just fatigue, confusion, or sheer bad luck.
So maybe before it was a fine or a civil suit for negligence.
Now prosecutors can bring felony manslaughter, reckless endangerment, charges carrying potentially decades in prison, even for accidents.
The punishment severity is dictated by the outcome, not the intent. If the result is bad enough, the law has tools to make it a felony, regardless of the person's actual mindset.
It effectively lowers the bar for proving criminal intent, or rather, it substitutes the severity of the outcome for intent while keeping the penalties high. This feeds into what Lake calls the emotional economy of justice.
Okay, that phrase again. His summary of the moral climate here is chilling. He says, in this system, forgiveness isn't just seen as weak, it's heresy.
Heresy, that's a strong word. It implies violating a core belief.
And the core belief is?
The absolute necessity of blame. In this emotional economy, Lake argues, someone must be blamed for significant harm. To forgive, or even just to acknowledge publicly that it was truly just an accident.
Means removing the required culprit.
Exactly. And if the community accepts the suffering was random, the system hasn't delivered its expected emotional payoff. The tension isn't resolved.
The public's emotional debt, that need for catharsis, goes unpaid, so the law has to reject the possibility of a no-fault accident.
To maintain its function as this tool for managing public emotion, yes, punishment becomes the only acceptable form of closure.
Any attempt to understand the person, show compassion,
Is seen almost as an attack on the victim's suffering, a betrayal. Forgiveness fundamentally breaks the transaction.
which brings us to Lake's final and perhaps most profound warning. When the state starts criminalizing basic human imperfection, punishing biological inevitability, he says it dismantles the moral foundation of law itself. What foundation is he talking about?
He argues the very purpose of law gets warped. Traditionally, law is supposed to be a guide. It tells us what's acceptable, what's not, sets boundaries based on intent and action.
Okay.
But if the law starts punishing things that are reflexive, accidental, things people literally can't control,
Yeah.
how can it be a reliable guide anymore? You can't guide an involuntary action.
So if it stops being a guide, what does it become?
An instrument of emotional satisfaction, he says. That's the core change. If the main goal is making the public feel better after a tragedy, then finding the objective truth takes a backseat to satisfying the mood.
And if that's the goal, Lake draws a really bleak conclusion. The system might start to manufacture guilt to serve social stability.
Yeah, that's where the idea of protecting the innocent really breaks down for him.
Manufacturing guilt. It sounds like prioritizing getting a conviction over getting the right conviction.
If stability requires a villain, the system might work backwards from the tragic outcome to ensure someone is found guilty, even if the evidence for true criminal intent is thin or based on misinterpreting human error.
So, if acknowledging the person's lack of intent would cause social unease,
Then that person, the one who made the human error, might be sacrificed to absorb the collective anger and maintain calm. The system stops protecting the innocent individual if doing so conflicts with the perceived needs of the collective.
and this whole process, Lake argues, teaches citizens some really damaging lessons about morality. He lists 3 specifically. First, that empathy is optional.
Right. If the state itself, through the courts, refuses to consider mitigating factors, fatigue, panic, biological limits, if it won't show understanding for human weakness, why should individuals? The law sets a tone. Punishment over compassion.
Second lesson, understanding is secondary. The why doesn't matter as much as the what.
The details, the context of the split-second decision, the pressures, they become irrelevant next to the awful consequence. Complexity gets flattened. Nuance is ignored.
And the third lesson sounds the most corrosive, that punishment, even if misapplied, is the only acceptable expression of care.
Yeah. When something terrible happens, the societal script seems to demand retribution above all else. Not necessarily support for victims or systemic reform, but inflicting pain on the person deemed responsible. Lake suggests this makes punishment a substitute for genuine care or concern, which ultimately hardens society.
So by refusing to accept innocent tragedy, by demanding punishment for basic human fallibility, Lake believes the state actively promotes a moral standard that's, well, fundamentally unforgiving.
And hostile to our own nature. We end up learning to see our own potential errors, our own reflexes, through a criminal lens because the system demands it.
Wow, okay. This deep dive into Justin Lake's paper really forces you to face a tough reality, doesn't it? About how our justice system might be blurring lines.
It really does, conflating basic human error, what he calls the inevitable toll of awareness, with actual intentional moral failure.
And Lake isn't just critiquing, he's making a call to action, isn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He insists that to restore the moral authority of the system, we have to reclaim the idea that making a mistake, even a devastating one, isn't automatically a moral crime. It's sometimes just the price of being conscious.
You can't legislate away our biology.
You can't. His whole argument rests on this a willingness, maybe societal, maybe psychological, to accept that terrible things can happen without malice, without blame. He uses the science of us to show the injustice in that.
It means stepping back from demanding purely emotional satisfaction.
And reconnecting with a more rational idea of culpability. We have to be able to separate the tragic outcome, which deserves sorrow and support, from the question of criminal intent, which needs cool, objective facts.
And Lake leaves us, and you listening, with a really potent final thought, something to chew on long after we finish here. Yes. A civilization that cannot forgive its own reflexes cannot call itself civilized at all.
That really puts it starkly, doesn't it? Can we tolerate our own inherent imperfection without demanding punishment for every single slip-up? It challenges us to think about what we're really seeking when we demand accountability. Is it justice, or is it just the comfort of vengeance?